we had at that time a leftist government. And I thought he gave a tremendous impulse to think twice about how bad it is, how bad the leftist government. Now we have a Myanmar government, supposedly a conservative party government.
Yes.
But I think there are still tax remains high, and he tried to reform education, but I think it's not for creativity. But we are now big English language learning fever all spread all over the country. And although we thought that the Korean is much educated, but still we don't know how to differentiate from mad cow disease from the United States. It's bad thing or good thing. We got all involved. And Koreans are now we have now 2 long weekends this year, May. And so, do you have any other impromptu question? Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Sorman. As always, it's a pleasure to listen to you. Right now, the world is pretty much...
Will you state your name and where you belong?
My name is Julian Kim. I'm advisor to the chairman of the Hillsong Corporation. The world is wondering what's happening with the economy, and specifically with the U.S. is in recession or is moving into recession over Obama. Now, the ultimate judge, or at least official judge in the United States, is National Bureau of Economic Research, which unfortunately has to wait until the time has gone by to say that whether it was in recession or not. What is your sense of the U.S.? You seem to be very optimistic about the impact of the financial crisis is rather limited, and the real economy will go on. However, there is a concern that a lot of U.S. leadership recently was depending on its financial services being the forefront of the world. Yet, right now, it's very much under question because there is a question whether people really understood what's going on, and I think there will be some time before. I'd like to hear your opinion. Thank you.
It's a $1 billion question, this one. I observe that since the crisis started, everybody is talking about a recession. What we have in the United States now since more than 2 semesters is slow growth, less than 1%. But we don't have negative growth, so technically we should talk about slow growth, but it's not a recession. And also the job market has not really been impacted by the slow growth, and certainly some people are not paid as well as they are, but the level of unemployment remains extremely low. Inflation is under control, which is of course extremely important for the future, because if it was not, it would be a threat on future investment. And what was feared was a credit crunch. Companies, and mostly small companies, unable to borrow because the banks would not lend to them. The credit crunch did not happen. So far, the worst has been avoided, and the US economy is still growing, and the fundamentals have not been impacted. Why is this? I think one of the reasons is that the crisis has been rather well managed, and that the United States authorities, monetary authorities and the Treasury, they did learn from former crises. And the good thing about economics is that you make mistakes, but sometimes you learn from your mistakes. And this is why economics is becoming a science, relatively. The two major mistakes which could have been committed and had been committed in 1930 and the 1970s was in the 1930s to close the borders and to get into a very protectionist economy, and this has aggravated the American crisis during 10 years. So now economists do agree, there is a consensus on the fact that the 1930 crisis was severe, but became a disaster because of the mistaken intervention of the central bank and of the government. In this case, it was very clear that the government and the treasury would not go for protectionism and would not go for regulation, but on the contrary, considered that the capitalism is able to cure itself spontaneously to a certain degree. Another mistake which has not been done was the mistake made in the 70s when the Keynesian policies were applied for the first time, and there has been a tremendous increase of cash, of credit in the economy from the Federal Reserve System. And remember, the United States discovered a new name had to be invented for that: stagflation, stagnation plus inflation. So this mistake has not been committed again. And so I think one of the reasons why so far the crisis in the system has not brought more severe consequences is because of good management, and good management based on the knowledge which has been accumulated during the two former crises. And the same kind of scientific lessons have been absorbed by all the other economies and central banks around, and you see that there is kind of a coordination within certain limit with all the between all the key players, central banks in Asia, in Europe, and in the United States. So I think this is why it's right now under control. However, if I may add something, there is a risk in the coming time in the United States that there will be a lack of credit, which could impact the investment in the United States. And the big question is, will the United States government accept the so-called sovereign funds to invest in the US economy? And somebody would have to answer to that question. Will the US and also the Europeans, will they accept the Chinese, Kuwaiti, and the other Russian sovereign funds? And I think they will. First of all, because they will be needed financially, and also because the risks are limited. If sovereign funds are invested in your country, in your industry, they are part of your system. And you remember in the 80s, there was the same debate in the United States when Japanese companies were taking over real estate in New York and in California. Americans were saying it's not possible, that we can't sell the Rockefeller Center to the Japanese. But the Japanese were not able to take the Rockefeller Center with them and bring it back to Japan. So I think it is the same case right now. Sovereign funds sooner or later will be invested not only in treasury bonds, but they will be invested in the real US economy. It will be one of the long-term consequences of the so-called crisis which takes place right now.
There's a question raised by floor by students. Mr. Lee from SNU. May I read this question?
Sure, yes, please.
My question may not be directly related to your lecture, but do you think that EU as an organization is suffering from democratic deficit? I don't know what democratic deficit is.
Yeah, I know.
If so, does it have any impact in economic area as well? That's the question raised. But I take your question just after this answer.
Okay, very rapidly. Well, any students knows what democratic deficit is in the European Union. I'm not sure that members of the Union know what it is. It's a kind of a code word. It means that the key decisions are made by the Brussels authorities, the Commission, and the Commission basically is elected by nobody. So it's considered as not being a very democratic system. But the Commission may be not elected, the Commission members are selected by the government, but they are acting within the European Constitution. So therefore, they have a very clear mandate. So I don't think that we have a democratic deficit, because the Commission does respect the mandate which it has received from the so-called European Constitution. And also, I will add very happily something on the European Union. The European Union has been built as a free trade organization in order to erase war from Europe. Okay? The starting point of the European Union was how to get rid of war after 1,000 years of wars between ourselves. The answer is free trade. So the purpose of the European Union is free trade. And all the decisions which are taken by the Brussels Commission are made to increase the free trade. If you want to have free trade, you need to eliminate regulation, or you have common regulation. You need to eliminate state subsidies, and you need sooner or later to have one common currency. Okay? And Europe as a free trade zone has been a tremendous success. It has been a success not only economically, but also it has been a diplomatic success, because there are no more wars in Europe. People tend to forget that this was the purpose of Europe. So now some politicians and scholars, they say, what's next? Why don't we use Europe? We need to counter the influence of the United States. Why don't we build a strong European army, a strong European diplomacy? But first, this was not the purpose of Europe. And also, the Europeans do agree to free trade and to share their prosperity, but they disagree on their vision of the world. Some are pro-Americans, like the British or the Poles. Some are rather anti-Americans, like the French and the Spanish. So there is no possible unity to build Europe as a counter power vis-à-vis the United States. I modestly think that we should stay with the initial agenda because it has been so successful, and I think the lesson for the rest of the world is that free trade leads to peace. Not necessarily, it's not a sufficient condition, but it does really help to make the people more civilized in their relationship.
My name is Han Chun-yang, Professor of Economics at John University. Mr. Sorman, I'm really in full agreement with the point you raised. The labor market flexibility and higher education system mutually reinforce to regain the growth momentum. As you might know, as you pointed out, Korea really has serious problems in these two fronts, labor market flexibility as well as higher education system. A newly born the Korea's Lee government actually enjoyed a landslide victory on the promise that the Korea would gain a new growth momentum, pledging what you call the 747. Do you know about that? Yeah, okay. To raise our growth rate to 7% and making Korea's per capita income 4 $40,000 within the next 10 years and making Korea 7th biggest economy in the world community. So my question is that after seeing the performance of the President Sarkozy, who also promised and tried to deliver a reform agenda in those labor market flexibility, your education system. But recently I read that the Economist reported that his performance during the first year was rather very disappointing, not really met with his promise he campaigned. So my question is that what Korea's member government can learn about President Sarkozy's performance, although he really pushed for his reform agenda during the first 1 year. So please.
Keep one wife at a time so you don't get distracted. And Sarkozy's private life really was an embarrassment for him and for the nation during 6 months. And he got completely distracted, and people were only interested in his private life. So he was really unable to make any decision. So that's been a disaster. But well, things happen. So. But the fact that the president was not focused on his office is really a terrible consequence. But if we put aside this private person aspect of Sarkozy, what can we learn? Which is maybe more general consequences. 2 things. First, you need to have a very clear political agenda. And in the case of Sarkozy, the political agenda was not clear. He promised everything to everyone. And if you don't have a clear-cut agenda, anyway, if you are not prepared to have enemies, you are lost. You must be prepared to have enemies. And you must be ready to say, here are the people I will be working with, here is my opposition, and we don't have the same vision. Sarkozy wanted to include everybody in his government. He put a lot of socialist members at key positions in the government. Therefore, this very nice and charming consensus building does prevent him from taking difficult decisions. He has become the prisoner of his own socialist minister. He cannot take decisions which would send the socialist minister out of the government. So you better keep with your own people, with your own majority. Don't try to build a consensus. Okay? No consensus. I think in a democracy, consensus building is not necessary. You have a majority, you have an opposition. If the opposition is not happy, they will run again the next time, and maybe it will be their turn. And as I said before, clear-cut agenda and explain. As I said before, if you are in favor of a free market policy, you should explain that you don't do that because you are a committed ideologue. You don't do that because you are in love with some free market economist or you want to copy the United States. No. You do that for the good of your own country. And you have to explain in very simple terms what it means for every Korean. I'm choosing this kind of policy because you in this place, in 3, 4, 5 years from now, you will be better off. And so communication is a key element in a free market-oriented policy. If you apply a left-wing policy, you don't need to explain because it's nice. Basically, it's nice. You are with the nice people and it's good for the people, so communication is not necessary. But free market, you need to explain because the spontaneous reaction of the people is negative. So, clear-cut agenda, no consensus, explain constantly that it is for the good of the people. I mean, this is the kind of recommendation I could do based on the French experience, because this has not been done in the case of France. It had been done in UK by Madame Thatcher, it had been done by Ronald Reagan, and strangely enough, it had been done by Schröder in Germany. When Schröder in Germany, being a social democrat, explained why he was cutting welfare, he was able to convince the people that he was cutting welfare for the benefit of the German people. And this was understood. And also there was a very strong argument used by Schröder, who worked very well in Germany. It was the argument of seriousness. Let's be serious. Okay? Let's not try to sell kind of economics which looks nice, but works people, you deserve a serious economic policy. We have to balance the budget because we are serious. We have to fight inflation because we are serious. But the argument of seriousness, which was kind of a cultural argument, was also extremely helpful in promoting the kind of policy which has been implemented in Germany. So those are some of the arguments which maybe could be used.
Well, there's another question raised by Mr. Steve John, CEO, AIMS, AIMS. He wrote in Korean, but I just translated my way. Will a free trade agreement between South Korea and the EU be mutually beneficial to both economies?
The answer is yes, and I don't see how it could be no. I think there is no example coming to my mind of a free trade agreement which is bad. I have no example in the recent world of any free trade agreement which is bringing disaster when the benefits are evident. The problem is that, as you know, free trade does increase mobility and flexibility. Therefore, free trade agreement is good if the country is prepared to adapt very rapidly. And this brings us back to the labor flexibility question and education question. But within this framework, I mean, there is no debate about it. But of course, you'll have certain lobbies which will be opposed and certain insiders which will be opposed. Therefore, we get back to this essential aspect of a free market policy, which is communication. And this communication should always insist on that, maybe always rooted in the national culture. And when I mentioned Schröder, when he was using German concepts to explain, when I say my policy is serious, German means a lot. In France, seriousness maybe wouldn't be the right concept, but it's good, to root the economic policy in the national tradition. There's always this risk with free trade and with this kind of free market that it looks too American. That's good for the United States. No, you have to bring it back to their own tradition. The bourgeois tradition of Korea, the work ethics in Korea, the merchant tradition in Korea, so that people can connect national interest, free trade and free market. It's not some kind of a foreign gimmick which is brought in Korea. It is a true civilization of Korea to act as entrepreneurs.
Okay, there's another question, very interesting question raised by Ms. Julie, KPL and Associates. It is reported that Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Finland, Norway, I thought that Denmark is part of the Scandinavian country.
Yeah.
Finland, my way.
Well, can be discussed.
The Scandinavian countries are ahead of the United States in terms of productivity level and the national competitiveness, even though they maintain mixed economic system by socialism, high level of taxes and welfare, and a less flexible labor market. Also, some reports point out that prospect for Ireland economy is not good because it is too vulnerable to foreign factors. I am wondering your response on such reports.
Okay. Well, there are some rumors about Ireland very recently because of the level of indebtedness indebtedness of Irish companies. And there is a fear for a credit crunch in Ireland. It's true that the growth of Ireland has been tremendous since 20 years, and basically it's been based, a bit like in mainland China to a certain extent, to foreign investment. And there is a fear that, once again, there is a credit crunch threatening Ireland. So far, those are only rumors, but nothing really happened. So I don't think that Ireland is really threatened by that. But there are many people who don't like the success of Ireland because it's too much dependent on the foreign investment. So I think it's more like a nationalistic reaction. But for the Irish people so far, the situation has been very good. What you said about Scandinavia was true. It's no more true. It's no more true. Starting in the 80s, the Scandinavian countries completely transformed themselves. There's been a high level of privatization, especially in Sweden. Nearly everything has been privatized. And even the local services have been privatized, schools have been privatized, kindergarten have been privatized. And so this idea of the so-called Swedish model, which had been extremely popular all over the world in the 70s and the 80s, I mean, the Swedish model doesn't exist anymore. It is true that there is a kind of, I would say, a feeling of social responsibility in Scandinavian countries, but which is less geared to the institution than geared to the local culture. Those are very small number of people, very small number, and therefore there is a sense of solidarity which is more rooted in the common civilization, in common religion. So people would behave in a less selfish way, I would say, that they would in Europe. But it has more to do with the civilization. It has nothing more to do with the institutions. They have been completely erased. The case of Denmark is very interesting, and it's been studied and studied over. You have it's a complete flexible labor market in Denmark, completely flexible. And we have no time to get into details, but you can be fired overnight, more easily than in the United States. But there is a kind of a system which is financed by the companies, which take care of you immediately, so that you will be retrained and, if possible, put into another company. It's called flexi security. So everybody now is going to Denmark and to study the system, but the system of a combination of total flexibility and total security, I think it works because it's a very small country. It's a very small country where everybody knows everybody. And so it's quite easy, like in Singapore, it's quite easy to organize system in very small nations where there is such a kind of a family relationship. And just one remark, because I think we didn't talk about that in the case of South Korea. This welfare system, the big bureaucratic welfare system like in France, of the small locally managed welfare system like in Scandinavia, they have now to deal with a completely new population, which are the migrants. And the migrants, they don't have the same kind of behavior than the other people, and sometimes they would come to France or the Netherlands or Sweden because of the welfare system. And this is very disruptive, and it creates a new kind of problem. We have no time to elaborate on this morning, but in any country where the demographic is going down, it's the case in South Korea. South Korea will be confronted, already starts being confronted with immigration. And immigration creates, Japan is confronted with immigration. And immigration creates a new kind of problem. New kind of problem.
Guest workers from abroad.
Yeah, guest workers. And but the guest workers not always wait for being invited. Sometimes they come without being invited. And so in South Korea it has not been a major problem so far. But because of your demographics, I'm quite sure that it will become a major problem. Take a country like Japan. Japan is discovering that there are millions, not only of Filipino made, but there are millions of workers from Iran and from Pakistan. Okay? There are millions of workers. So this creates a new situation, and it is the same, as you know, in the United States, where when you have a welfare system, where you have immigrants, can the immigrants access to the welfare system under what condition? And in the case of France, we have millions of immigrants who come because of the welfare system. They are perfectly rational. They want good schools free, they get them. They want to access to good health care, they get it. Why wouldn't they come? So it's not their problem, it's we who are not perfectly rational. So what I mean by that is that any welfare system now, including South Korea, must be devised by taking into consideration the fact that in countries like yours, you'll have more and more guest workers.
Any other question?
There's one out there.
My name is Julie from Korea Exchange. Thank you very much for your fruitful lecture today. Today you stressed a lot the importance of working hours, quantity of working hours. With this regards, somewhat I agree, but somewhat I don't agree. Still, the quantity of working hours is very important. However, I think the way of thinking and the working method and the system is much more important than that of working hours. Too much work is sometimes hinders and interferes the creativity. Mention two examples. First one is the collapse of communism. The communist countries, the average working hours of the communist countries is very similar that of capitalist countries. But the productivity and the growth rate is far below than that of capitalist countries. Second one is the productivity of IT system. The computer system saves the working hours a lot. With this regards, what is your opinion? Thank you very much.
Well, when we are talking about the quantity of work hours as a parameter to explain growth rate, we are talking within homogeneous systems. Okay, I'm not comparing, for example, North Korea with South Korea. I'm comparing countries which basically use the same techniques and they are producing the same kind of things with the same style of management. And so the Prescott theory, because it is a Prescott theory, the Prescott theory works only within homogeneous economic system. And one of the surprises of the Prescott theory, which is now part of the economic consensus, was to show how important is the quantity of hours and to what extent it cannot be compensated by productivity gain. But once again, I won't elaborate. I mean, please have a look at the Prescott theory directly in Prescott or in my book if you want to gain time. And now when you were talking about the communist economy, you all remember this old joke, that the workers pretended to work and the Communist Party pretended to pay them.
Well, any further questions? Yes, please.
Thomas Mataka, the Czech ambassador. I very much enjoyed your lecture, not just by mentioning some positive in my country too, but I found one thing that I consider somehow inconsistent. It's rather a remark than question actually, that of building the national brand and the advice to Korea to build the national brand. What I think is that in the market system you actually have the companies that build their brands and are more aware of giving the message rather than nations, and I think that France and perfumes and Italy and fashion and Germany and cars is something which we got from the past, but something which you really can't, or it's not something that you should, or is wise to promote for the future. And then a question, if I may, the slow growth of Europe, do you think that, or the role of European Union in it, does it have no relevance, or without EU would it be even slower, or is it the stifling European bureaucracy that made it so slow, or made a part of it in making it so slow? Thank you.
Thank you. On the second question, the so-called European bureaucracy, if you mean by that the people in Brussels, it's a very small administration compared to the size of the European Union, and certainly they are not slowing down growth. On the contrary, I will stress the two benefits of the European Union in terms of growth. First, anything which is done in terms of deregulation. The European Commission has been extremely efficient to deregulate, for example, the telecommunication market. And we had no telecommunication market in Europe. I mean, we had no cell phones, I mean, we had nothing. And same for airline, any kind of communication, transportation. All this has been deregulated by the European Commission, and the growth has been tremendous because of this deregulation. And this deregulation could be done only at a European level because no national government had the courage to take this kind of decision. Because the lobbies against deregulation was so strong in countries like Germany or France that deregulation would not have been possible. Thank God, I mean, the national government today are able to say, well, it's not our fault, these bad guys in Brussels are deregulating the energy market. And, but the bad guys are doing the right thing. And the same goes with the euro. Everybody agrees to criticize the Frankfurt Central Bank, but it's good that we have the central bank, because one of the major distortions of the European economies, as we all remember, was inflation. And because of the euro, we don't have inflation anymore. And not having inflation, this has two good consequences. Prices are stable, and three good consequences. Retired people get their pensions, and investments are real investment and not speculation. So deregulation and the European currency are really the two pillars of growth in Europe. If we didn't have that, I think we would be in a much worse situation. Now about the brand. I mean, should countries be promoted as a brand? Isn't it only the job of the private company? Well, I think both. Private companies do promote their own brands, and to have a lot of brands, of course, is a source of wealth. America is #1 because you are able to quote 100 American companies. You can quote many German or Japanese brands, and some Czech brands can be quoted also. Not very many about South Korea, zero about mainland China, which shows how backward the mainland China economy is. There is not one mainland Chinese brand which is recognized globally. So beyond that, should a nation promote its brand? It's difficult because, as you know, a brand is a consequence of history. and so it's not easy. I mean, how to promote Zimbabwe as a brand, or it's not very easy. But for some countries can do that. Japan did it. Clearly, Japan did it in the 60s. Japan decided to rebuild, and they put a lot of money in that, and the Olympic Games in 64 were part of this reconstruction process to have a positive and very strong image of what made in Japan means. It was a deliberate policy, and it is still going on, and they still put a lot of money in that. It's very cleverly done, I must say. So for some countries it's good, it can be done, and it has economic advantages, because once again you can sell at a higher price if the country can be related to kind of a dream. To stick with a very easy example, French perfume, you pay French perfume 10 times the real price because they are French. And the same perfume sold by Belgium wouldn't get the same price even if it was the same perfume. So I think in the case of China, they sell because it's cheap. And it was the case with South Korea. It was the case with Japan. In the 1920s and 1930s, Japan was cheap. Okay? So South Korea is in between. So I think there is a deficiency in the perception of what South Korea is about, and I think this can be corrected because you have some kind of historical basis. I would not recommend that in any civilization, but I think for South Korea it can work, and South Korea as a brand can be considered, to use an economic concept, as a public good, and a public good justifies some kind of public investment.
Well, time is really crunching for 9 o'clock, and let's just conclude. As a moderator, I really appreciate your insightful presentation, and also I thank for the audience displaying patience. Thank you so much.